Hello everyone, this is Kei Seto Kaiba, and we are back with another chess video. So, of course everyone knows how much I advocate for opening principles, especially for beginners. It is very useful, not going to deny that. Definitely something that you should be aware of or, learning towards if you're just starting out. However, these opening principles can become a problem if you only stick with them kind of dogmatically and you're not open to some other ideas. And some of these opening principles I like a lot more than others. Now, everyone could always pick really obscure examples where there's some exception to the rule. These are guidelines, they're not absolute exact rules. And so take something very simple like castle early. That's a very good idea. Oftentimes, castling will get your king to safety. You'll develop one of your rooks in the corner. What's wrong with that? It does two things in one move. It's productive. It, develops your rook out of the corner, which is development. And your king safety is something that cannot be underestimated. Castle in early is going to get you out of trouble a lot of the time. And if you're a complete beginner or someone just starting out, it is super helpful. However, as we know from GM games, some of these grandmasters will leave their king in the center of the board, and their king will be safe, and maybe even have a good position. And so, of course, these are those small exceptions to the rule. And so it's a simplification. Opening principles is not going to work in 100% every situation. You might fall for traps. You might fall for some stuff. This is why you have to study and, improve your game and improve your overall understanding. With that being said, opening principles are still super useful. Now, one of these principles I don't like as much is the principle you should develop your knights before bishops. And I'm going to do a little bit of myth busting here. I'm going to say that one is more false. Now, generally, I'd say most of the time you get your knights out first. But I don't think that's really so much of a principle as more indirectly. So that's what I'm going to try and clarify today. So let's get a little deeper. Why is knights before bishops the standard, even if it's not necessarily true? Well, let's show with an example. Let's say e4, the most common opening, most likely. E4 and D4 definitely the most too. Probably E4 is even more common. E5, very popular. Okay, we're using opening principles. We're controlling the center. Looks good. We're going to develop our pieces soon. Okay, that's fine. And we'll maybe even try and castle early. That'll be fine, and everything is all fine, and we'll continue moving on. Decent game, whatnot. Not much to say here. We'll develop a piece, knight f3. Okay, so by this logic, we are developing this knight ahead of our corresponding bishop. So in this example, we are going to take knights before bishops very literal and see where it gets us. So here we have knight f3, which is what opening principles would probably tell you. I don't think this is necessarily only mindset. I think it could have drawbacks, but we'll get to that soon. So if our opponent took this very literal, and they also do the same, they're going to play knight c6. And these are probably the best moves you could possibly play in these positions. So it seems like, what's wrong with this? Well, here, what would white do now? Of course, there's many good openings. We're so very early in the game. Pretty much anything white does is probably going to have some advantage just because white moved first and we're so very early in the game. But if we take this very literal and we think, well, how do we develop? How do we control the center? Well, one might be tempted to say, well, let's develop our other knight. Let's go knight to c3. And although this is an okay opening, what will black do? Well, if they want to think the exact same way, then they will play knight f6. And great, we've developed the knights literally before the bishops, and maybe later we can develop the bishops. And although this is okay, this opening is known as the four knights game, we will also know that the four knights game tends to be a bit drawish. This is very symmetrical. What is either side supposed to really do? And you get a playable position, it's okay, but is this really best? So if we were to go back a few moves, if we were to go back, maybe not that far, maybe we'll go back here, right before knight c3. And so we will think, well, how can we develop, in this case the knight, but also think about castling? And immediately comes to mind is this bishop is in the way, and we would like to castle. We want to do multiple things at once. So one might be tempted to say, well, let's develop the bishop. And of course, we're going to get to the very common openings. If they go bishop c4, this is the Italian game. If we go bishop to b5, this is the Ruy Lopez opening. Both are very solid openings. Now, they're not the only two openings. There's many other options available, which are also good for white. But this is what you're thinking about with opening principles, and you'll get a very playable position. But is that position necessarily best? Not necessarily. You just get a decent position. Now, if you don't know what to do, opening principles are very helpful shortcuts. They're based on fundamentals. You get your pieces developed, but is it really the most optimal square for your piece? And that's something that you don't really start thinking about until you've kind of passed at opening principles. You go through certain stages in your chess journey where like you start off with things like, well, I'm not developing pieces, I just move things. And then later you start thinking, oh, there's a lot of value in this. Let's develop our pieces. And then I think when you get to a little higher level, you start thinking, well, yeah, I could develop. I could just go like bishop e2 here. But is it really active? Not really. Bishop e2 is kind of passive. If they were to go bishop to d3 instead, they're blocking their own pawn, so that's probably no good. And so then I think of maybe 1600 level players probably thinking, well, let's go bishop c4 or bishop b5 because we want to be active. And that's a good way of thinking. But I think a higher rated player, maybe 1800 plus range, is probably thinking not so much let's get active. They're thinking, where does this bishop actually belong? Where is its most optimal square? And that's where we start getting a lot, into this little deeper thinking of chess. Because what happens if we play bishop b5? And then for whatever reason later in the game, maybe this diagonal is actually not so great for a bishop. Maybe the c4 score is actually better. Well then, our bishop's on b5, we're going to have to spend an extra move to go back to c4. And yeah, we'll have an improved position on our diagonal, but we've wasted time. We've played bishop to b5, and then later we've gone back to c4. That's 2 moves. We could have just spent 1 move going to bishop c4. And I could say the same problem the other way. What if we chose bishop c4? But then just by how the game evolves, we later find out, actually, the bishop might actually belong better on b5. And then we have to waste a second move to put it to its most optimal square. And let's not be limited in our thinking. Let's not only think it's these 2 squares. What if we were to play the g3 pawn? The g pawn up to g3. Well, now we have other options. Maybe fianchetto was a good option. Maybe control this entire long diagonal here. Maybe even the creative bishop to h3 in some lines is actually where the bishop belongs. And so, if we're not actually sure where the bishop belongs, should we actually commit the bishop early? And usually the answer is no, we don't. Because if we don't know where it belongs, then why put it there? We might have to waste a move. Now, here's where the knight thing comes into effect. Knights are a lot easier, because with knights, if we were to go back here, almost always the knight is going to be most active on this square because it will control the center and simultaneously develop. It's very active. And so because of that, this knight f3 is a very good move. And knight to c3 is also a good move. And so our white knights will usually belong in these squares. Similar with black. They'll also want to develop. These are the most active squares for the knight. And so almost always, the knight is going to be best on these 4 squares. And so if you think, well, let's develop our knights first, then you're not going to be too bad. You'll just develop to one of those 4 squares because it's probably going to belong there. And then later you can develop the bishop. But this is kind of a superficial way of thinking. It's not really understanding why we're delaying something. So let me give an example of a solid opening, which I'm sure everyone knows of, where we're actually not getting the knight out first. So if we play d4, we play d5, and then knight f3. Okay, that's fine. We're getting this knight out before this corresponding bishop. That's okay. Say our opponent plays knight to f6. Now here, if you're thinking purely opening principles and trying to get developed, you might be thinking maybe like knight c3, which is okay. You might get some kind of other thing. Might have like pawn to e3, maybe trying to get this bishop developed. Also solid, good opening. However, there's a very common opening here I'm sure most people are familiar with. Yes, I'm talking about bishop to f4, the very common London system. Yes, that's right. The London system develops their bishop before their corresponding knight. And so why is this? Well, there's a very specific reason we have to get our bishop out first. And that is, we want to play e3 in the London, and we want to keep this bishop outside of the pawn chain. If we were to play e3 first, develop this knight and then play e3 or something like that, this bishop is not getting out. So there was a priority. We had to develop the bishop before. And so here, like the game continues pretty standard for the opening, we'll close the bishop outside the pawn chain. Maybe our opponent will do something. We'll play c3, get our pawns on this little pawn triangle that the London system often does. Our opponent will develop plain with opening principles, and then we'll get the thematic knight b to d2. And so the knight actually belongs on this d2 square. And of course, if you've memorized opening theory and some of the common patterns of the London system, I'm sure a lot of people will know that this knight usually belongs there. But why does this knight actually belong here? Well, if we were to go back, let's think. What was the natural square for the knight? Well, remember I said these 4 squares are usually where the knight belongs. Not always, but usually. Well, this f3 knight, we've gotten it here. Congratulations, mission successful. Black has also done the same. They've gotten their knights to those optimal squares. Very active, nice position. Looks good. However, this c3 square, we have a pawn there. That is just part of the opening. Not much we can do about it. If we were to change, it's a different opening. And so the knight can no longer use its optimal square. So what are its other options? Well, we have knight b to d2, and we have knight a3. Now, with knight a3, where's this knight actually going? Well, it's not going to go here because this square is controlled by the pawn. And maybe we could advance to b5, but what is the knight actually doing there? It's kind of questionable, and in the meantime, this knight is on the edge of the board. So it's not really that great. And even if we were to play here, and our opponent was very worried that we'd hop into b5, not the only move, but if they were super scared, they could even play a6 and just keep our knight out. And now our knight looks kind of silly that it's on the edge of the board and not very active. So just by process of elimination, we can figure, well, the knight probably should go here. And so it's no surprise that with this opening, solid opening like the London system, the knight goes to a fairly active place. So with knights, it's very simple. We know they usually belong in these squares. And if they can't, we usually go somewhere else. Okay, fine. However, bishops, a little bit trickier. And so indirectly, there's a good reason to sometimes delay the bishops. In the London, which we were just showed, can put that back up. We had to get the bishop out first because we want it outside the pawn chain. And if we were to play, like, say, knight out first, will we get a chance to play bishop to f4? Maybe, not necessarily. And so, maybe they'll try and develop this way. Maybe they get their bishop here first. And then all of a sudden they're controlling this square and we're not able to get out. And, of course, if we were to play this exact way, like here, this knight to c3, well, now we can't actually play the c3 move that the London system is known for. Maybe it'll be some kind of Jobava London, maybe some kind of Chigorin. It depends how, both sides play and transpose, but we're certainly in a different opening. So for that being said, if you want the London, you're going to have to develop the bishop before the knight. So it's not really so much as an opening principle as it is thinking about, well, where are my pieces optimally placed? And if you don't know where they're best, maybe you should hold off on that move, let your opponent make a move or two, and then by waiting, you'll have a little bit of extra information based on what your opponent has done. And maybe then it'll be a little bit more clear where your pieces actually belong. Now, I'm going to bring up an example game that I had. And we're only looking at one position. We're not actually looking at a game. I only chose this because it's a very recent game I played, but there's nothing really special about it. Now here, I was black. So this opening was the Caro-Kann, how it started out. I'll just show it just for the sake of showing it. I'll just put up the first 2 moves. Opening went like this. It was the advanced variation. Played c3. Book move. Okay. I played e6. Again, I developed the bishop before the knight. Kind of an interesting moment there. Because again, very similar to the London, I want to get this bishop outside the pawn chain. And then I close the pawn chain. It doesn't make sense to close it, and then my bishop is somewhere else. So, alright. Our opponent plays bishop d3, trying to contest my nice bishop outside the pawn chain. I trade anyway. This is all book moves, by the way. And then here, I have a little bit of a decision. Where do my pieces belong? Now, let's think, what do I really want to do here? Well, black is a pretty good pawn structure. Okay, a lot of central pawns on light squares. But I've also traded off my light squared bishop, so I don't really have a bad bishop here. It's not really a huge problem. So really, I think both sides have a solid position. But specifically from black, what would black really want to do? Well, they've got nothing developed, so they would really want to develop a piece if possible. And maybe they would even like to get castled. Just good opening principles. Now, which way would black like to castle? Well, I don't really like castling queenside because we've pushed this pawn. If this pawn was back on c7, maybe I could consider it. But here, because we've pushed this pawn, if our king was on c8, we are exposed, in theory, along these diagonals, just because this pawn is no longer here guarding, being on c7. So this little pawn push to c6 would weaken my king quite a bit. And so I really don't want to castle that way. So if I don't want to leave the king in the center, and I do want to get castled, and queenside's not an option, I really only have to go kingside. So a possible idea might be thinking, well, how can I go kingside? I have to get the knight out, have to get the bishop out. And so let's think, well, where can my pieces best go? Well, there's a lot of pawns here, And with all these pawns, my dark square bishop does not really have many squares to go to. I can't go here because the pawn, can't go here because the pawn. You get the idea. I can't go to any of these squares because, of course, their pawns control it. So my bishop does not have many options. I also don't really know if I really want to play this. That seems like a really weakening move. If I want to castle this way, I want to keep my pawns very close to my king. That's a similar reason I didn't go queenside, because of this little pawn push. So I would prefer not to push this pawn. Maybe it can be justified pushing the g6 pawn if I choose to fiend shadow the bishop, but then my bishop isn't looking at much. Is that really the optimal square for the bishop? Probably not. It's probably just going to weaken my king, and I'm just looking at a wall of granite, this pawn thing here. I mean, how am I supposed to get past that? So that doesn't really look appealing to me. If I were to push here, I don't think there's any prospects in doing this. That just gives up my dark squared bishop, and now I have a bunch of dark square weaknesses that I have to worry about. All these squares would be weak if I push this pawn. So that doesn't really appeal to me. And so what are my options here? Well, my bishop, I'm not really sure where it goes. And maybe I could play here, but then that blocks this square for my other pieces, like my knight. My knight can't go there now, and I don't want to bring it out to the edge, and I can't go here because of this pawn. So I'm really kind of stuck from that sense. So if I don't know where the bishop goes, I don't move it. It's that simple. So okay, if we don't move the bishop, then what else can we move? Well, let's look at the knight. Well, very similarly, I could go here, but then I'm blocking my bishop, and I still don't know where my bishop is going to go. So that's not really ideal. I don't want to go here because, again, it's on the edge of the board. Maybe this bishop can also trade it off. Not really a good thing that I want. And, of course, I can't go here because of the pawn. So, again, this knight isn't really getting out, and this bishop isn't really getting out. Not ideal. Now, what other pieces are there? Well, my queen is a heavier piece, but those are usually going to be delayed. Same thing with the rooks. Usually these will come out later. So just by process of elimination, I'm now down to this knight. And it's not going to facilitate me castling kingside by moving this knight, but at least it keeps my options flexible. I'll be developing a piece, even though I don't know which is, going to be the best. So where does this knight belong? Well, if we remember, the key squares for the knight for activity are usually these 4 squares. So with that being said, this knight here would love to go to c6, but unfortunately it can't at the time being because this pawn is blocking. Now, what are my other options? Well, I can put it, over here, knight a6. Might not be the worst move in the world. Maybe I can relocate itself to c7. But again, for the time being, it's on the edge of the board, and it would take 2 moves to move somewhere else. So that's not really the best option in my mind. The other option is knight to d7. And it looks okay. Might even help support the c5 pawn. But is that the best? Well, I'm not really sure. So I think really I have a few options here. So if I'm thinking only on piece development, I think really the only move is to play knight to d7. Because it keeps my other options open, and I'm not really sure where my other pieces belong. And if I wait one move, maybe I'll figure out what my opponent is going to do. Maybe they'll make some committal move, and then I'll have a better idea where my other pieces, especially these 2, will belong. So if I want to develop, knight d7 is probably the best move for me. Now, of course, there's other options. I could also push the c5 pawn, and then maybe play knight c6. That's also playable. And maybe I could play something earlier, like I had this knight e7 idea, and then I'm blocking my bishop. But maybe this can go to, like, say, f5. That's a thematic idea. Now, in the game, I think all of these are playable options. Knight e7 is the best according to the engine. And the idea is, of course, going probably to f5. Now, I didn't really like that because I thought, well, if I go knight to e7, and I'll put it on the board, I thought, well, maybe bishop to g5 is a problem. And what I didn't know until my analysis after the game was I realized you can actually play h6 here. And if they drop back, I thought this was bad for black. I'm not really getting out of it, but I have not castled yet. And that's actually a really cool point because I can play this really cool idea pawn to g5. And their bishop is going to go back, but their bishop isn't really looking at much. It's looking at its own pawn. It's kind of cut off by, my forces here. And so I have really not weakened myself yet because my king is not castled. If my king was here on g8, this would be pretty bad, having my pawns here. Not something I would want. But my king is uncastled because I waited. So maybe now I could go queenside, get this queen developed somewhere or something like that. And then just castle queenside. And it's not ideal, but, hey, I've broken the pin and my king gets castled. So these are some ideas that I didn't really consider until afterwards when I analyzed the game. Now, because of that, I didn't know here that, this knight e7 was the best and playable. And so, you live and learn. Now, with that being said, I thought bishop to g5 was a problem. So if I eliminate that option, what else is there? Well, there's c5, and trying to get the knight to its optimal square anyway. And in the game, this option I did think of. However, I figured c5, I'm actually ripping open the center a little early. Maybe something like this, and this is okay, it helps me develop. But, the center is opening up a bit, and my king is still uncastled in the center. I could probably get castled later, and it's probably not the end of the world, but just from a practical standpoint, I don't really want to open the center if my king is uncastled there. I would much rather get castled and then open the center at my own pace. So, just by process of elimination, knight d7 was the only move that plays this, and that's what I played in the game. It's a very simple move, but it doesn't look like it does much, but I'm not committing these pieces. And if I'm not committing them to the squares that I don't know if they're best, this is going to be good because my opponent will have to make a move. In the actual game, they played knight to e2, which is a very strong move. And here, now I can think, well, how do I proceed? And just by using this process of elimination, in this case, yes, I did move the knight. But notice that, again, I moved the bishop, which was the corresponding bishop to that knight. I actually moved the bishop first. So in that sense, I kind of violated that opening guideline. And these are guidelines, not, exact rules. But kind of thinking the right process, the right mindset, I think is much more important of where your pieces are best placed than just blindly following opening principles. So as far as, exceptions go, you can always come up with an exception for a rule, so I don't want to sound like I'm nitpicking here, but I kind of want to take the thinking a little bit more advanced than just going with the opening principles blindly. It's a really good guideline. Most of the time, it's easier to develop the knights rather than the bishops. If we were to go back to our other example, I'm not going to put it up, but you might remember the 4 knights game. Knights before bishops, you get a solid position, but is it maybe optimal? Not necessarily. It just gets you a very playable position. And we know the knights are probably okay on these 4 squares because that just happens to be where they're most active. But if we delay that, if we're unsure what the best square is, we might actually save ourselves a move or two further down the road. And, those move or two can really add up. And, if you're playing a really tough opponent, like a grandmaster, that one move could cost you the game. And so by playing a move that we know we have to make, like knight d7, we really didn't want to, push this pawn in advance. We could have done that, but we didn't. For whatever reason in that game, I chose not to. I kind of wanted to support c5. It looks nice. And I really didn't want to do it from the edge. And since the square is blocked and this plan I didn't want to go with, just process of elimination. I knew the knight belonged on d7. And so I play it because I knew I wanted to play it. And very similar, you could think the exact same thought process with castling. Oftentimes, this same rule will apply, where you aren't sure which piece to develop, but you know you have to get castled. And so because of that, you should actually be looking to try and get castled immediately, because you know your king needs to be safe. It's something that you cannot postpone forever. But other pieces, like saying developing this bishop, I can postpone this for a while. I don't know where it'll be best, but I can wait a bit, and maybe later it'll be a bit more clear once the position changes. So hopefully it was a little more in-depth and insightful. I don't want to sound like I'm repeating ideas too much, but I realize a lot of these thoughts will probably be newer for a lot of people, and so sometimes I go a little in-depth just to kind of make sure I really hammer home the point and everyone gets it. A little repetition can also really help with improving long-term, because the more times you hear it, the more likely you are to remember it in a game. And for that, I hope everyone remembers these in their own games. And maybe consider, before you develop a piece, is this piece a piece I really want to move to that exact square? Or am I just developing it off the back rank just to get off the back rank and develop? It's more than just, is my piece active? It's actually, is my piece best on that location? And if you're not 100% sure, look at other pieces and think, what do I know belongs at a certain spot? And then you might actually want to play that move instead. So I hope everyone found this useful, and I will see you all in the next video.